Welcome everybody to the first day of Nodevember, the best month of the year when it comes to Blender proceduralism, and we're doing a prompt every single day for the next month. I'm doing a tutorial every day. We're going to get in the weeds, and today we're starting off a bit complicated, but not nearly as hardcore as we're going to get later on. So today's prompt was space. As you saw from that little intro I made, what we're going to do is we're going to take a cube. So all of this is a cube with the procedural material and all this, and we're going to do geo nodes and shader nodes. This is the first Nodevember where I'm actually using geometry nodes to make this planet, which not only is procedural, but you can of course control like the continents and like change the planet distribution and all this, as well as asteroids. The stars in the background are procedural, everything. Okay, so if this is interesting to you, let's hop into it. Blend file for patrons and Gumroad, I think I'll also make it available. So let's get started. Okay, so starting off, we're going to take everything, delete it, and add in a cube. And generally for this month, what we're going to do is we're always going to start off with a cube, and then in geometry nodes, we're going to add this in and get rid of this group input, so that everything we have in here, right, is all nodes, and there is no like pre-used primitive or anything like this. Okay. So to make a planet is the first thing. I want it to be an Earth-esque planet. What I want to do is I want to make a sphere and then kind of highlight the continents and say, make those kind of extruded out. Now you might think, okay, if we're making a planet start with a sphere, that's not really it. Because if we start with a sphere, what you're going to notice, and this is a trick I'm going to use a couple times, so check this out. When we use a sphere, you're going to notice that the geometry distribution is a bit wonky, right? We have these poles. Which is kind of like, you know, a planet which has poles, but I want my geometry distribution to be a lot better. So here's the trick we're going to use. We're going to use a cube primitive. You can have this have any amount of divisions, or maybe what we could do is to make it a bit more spherical. We can use a subdivision surface, plug that in, and then the more iterations, the more spherical it gets. So we have kind of this cuboid thing with better geometry distribution. And if I take this and use a set position node, anytime we're changing the geometry, we want to use set position. And I take this position and cast it to the normalized coordinates. So this is the trick I'm going to be using for almost every tutorial. This is going to give us a perfect sphere. So before we had this cuboid thing. It kind of looks like a sphere, but you can kind of tell that it's not perfect. The normalization will make it so that every point has a unit vector length, right? Which means that by definition, it's a sphere, okay? It's a sphere that we can control the resolution of. So I just want you to remember this is a thing we're gonna do over and over and over again. First order business is again to draw out these continents in a procedural way, because I don't want to use an image texture of the Earth or anything like this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use an extrude mesh that's gonna extrude everything. So I'm gonna take individual off so it extrudes it as a group. And we can use a noise texture to define our continent. So if I use this right here, you can see we get this amorphous blob. Every point has a value in this noise texture, and that tells it how much to extrude it by. But I want continent, so I'm going to color ramp this. So bring this down until we have only some areas that are above 0. And we're going to take this and make it less intense. So I'm going to take this and multiply it by like 0.1, make it a tenth as strong. And you can see what this does. What this does is it isolates these islands where the value is greater than 0, and then it extrudes them by a maximum of 0.1. To make this like bigger continents and not like a bunch of hills, take down the scale. So this makes more like individual chunks that aren't like too sparse or anything like this. We can take the detail, bring that up, and make this kind of higher contrast. And by the way, the color ramp is going to define how many continents we have, in a sense. So something like this, and I'm actually going to bring down, because the planet at a space scale, when you look at it from here, the continents don't bulge out that much. It looks like a sphere. So I'm going to divide this by 5. So it's a little subtle, but you can tell now we have continents. Cool thing about this is if you take the noise texture, use the W slider, you get different continents and all this. Now, a good thing to do at this point is we're going to be using geometry nodes and shader nodes. Both of these are procedural. So I'm going to make our link right now. I'm going to use a set material node and then In the shader editor, we can link the material. Let's call it planet, even though we all know that I mean Earth. Third planet, if you've ever seen Modest Mouse music. What I want to do is I want to take this attribute, in a sense, that tells us where the continents are, and match it to the material. So wherever we have, wherever we have a bit of extrusion, it should be land, otherwise it should be water. To bring this attribute over, we're going to also be doing this a lot. We're going to use store named attribute. So on to store named attribute, the color ramp, you don't need to multiply by 0.02 or anything like this. I just want the raw data of where the continents are, and I'm going to call this land. So now we have an attribute, as you can see in the spreadsheet, that tells us where there is and isn't land. When it's 0, no land. When it's bigger than 0, land. Either way, we use an attribute node to bring this in, make sure it's called the same thing, and now in the shader editor and rendered mode, you can see that we have kind of a black and white mask, which is this noise texture of our continents. And what we want to do is make a material that has water on one part and land on the other. What I'm thinking is, let me just set up a basic scene for now so that we can like test out the look of this, and then we're going to put it in space instead of like in a room. So I'm going to use HDRI lighting and all this. HDRI lighting. Even though this isn't procedural, we're going to get rid of it. But this is just to demo the look of this. So you can see now we have this well-lit sphere. I'm going to make one of these, to keep it simple, I'm going to make one of these kind of green, and I'm going to make the other one kind of blue to signify water and land. I'm going to mix these together, and I'm going to use this as the factor. And you can see now we kind of have our land and our water. Again, this is sending an attribute over to the shader editor, so if I was to change this, you can see we're getting different planets in this. We could bring up the detail. You can also change kind of the look of this by changing the roughness and stuff like this. Do you want blobular continents or very sharp continents? That's up to you. I'm just going to add a bit of distortion and maybe add one more layer of subdivision, just so we can see what's going on here. And now the name of the game is making good materials. We are going to do more geometry nodes for these asteroids and all this, but most of this is actually a shader effect, back to the old school Nodevember. Okay, starting off with the water. Water is blue. Profound. Water is blue, and it is reflective. Again, it's going to be reflecting the HDRI, but we're going to fix that. So even though you're seeing the reflection of the room, whatever, it's reflective. And water, this is going to be a bit of an exaggeration. What I'm about to do has waves. So I'm going to give this a bit of a texture. We're going to use a lot of normal mapping here. So to make waves, I'm going to use a noise texture. I just want to imply the existence of like water and waves and all this. So what I am going to do is I just got a text message, is why I'm flustered. People always texting me on Nodevember, but I'm dedicated to the grind of the tutorials. Noise texture, we want to turn this into a bump, or into normal. So we use a bump map to make it. We use a bump conversion to turn this into a normal map. Connect that here, and now you can see we have waves in a sense. They look horrible. Bring up the scale to make them tinier. Bring down the roughness to make them smoother, and bring up the distortion to make them feel more like waves. So we're getting somewhere, right? We crank this up to 50. We take down our normal strength, and you can see how this kind of implies water more so than what we had before. Similarly, we can do a couple modifications of our land in terms of normal mapping and color. I'm going to do them both in one sweep. So we can use a noise texture. The reason I'm using multiple noise textures and not using the same one is they're going to be at different scales. Okay. So this noise texture, I want to drive the color. Meaning I don't want the land to just be green, I want it to have a variation. So let's say one of the colors is like, some kind of greenish, and then we have some kind of deserty areas that are tan and all this. So let me make that a bit higher contrast. So let's preview what this looks like so far. So you can see our land now has a bit of variation. I'm going to up the detail and up the roughness here, so it kind of looks more evenly distributed. And I think the other color we'd want is white to imply snowy biomes and stuff like this. So I'm going to have some white that exists on the other side here. So we have some like polar caps and stuff like this. And I'm just playing with the distribution until I like the look of it. You can, depending on the planet you want, if you want it to be Mars, you could, like, for example, make it all red. But I'm going for something that looks a bit Earth-like. Okay, so we have that. I also, again, want to make these mountainous terrains and imply normal mapping and all this, so I'm going to use a bump node, connect that, and now we got something that looks pretty good. Let me take down the strength. Now, what we're going to do to this is we're going to fuck it up with, like, lighting, space background and stuff like this. So if it doesn't look perfect yet, don't worry, we're going to work on it. But what I want you to make sure of is that you like the distribution of your continents. Again, we can change this at any time and the materials will apply correctly. I actually kind of like the look of this one. By the way, we should save. We'll call this Nodevember Live, again available on Patreon and Gumroad. And at this point, I think we want to start adding in more material details. So we have the land, which I guess should be a bit rougher. And then the water's pretty reflective. That's fine. We take these, we mix them together. Now let's mix in more BSDFs and get a bit more detail. So I'm going to mix shader again. This time we're going to use a Fresnel node, and this is what's really going to make it look like a planet. It has this kind of like bordering effect because it's a sphere and it's looking at the view normals and all this. But because we slightly extruded our continents, we're going to get a bit of a contour, which I think looks nice. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to mix in a emissive material to create kind of this atmosphere, in a sense. So you can see I've mixed in this atmosphere that only shows at the border, right? So if I make it red, you can really tell. We're going to go for kind of this bluish, whitish kind of look. That's going to make it look more planet-like, especially when we turn down the HDRI and stuff like this, and we actually need to rely on our lighting. Other than that, I think the last thing is we're going to add in clouds. So another mixed shader, another noise texture, and we're going to do clouds in a cheap way. We don't need to do volumetrics or anything like this, right? All we need to do is use a color ramp to, again, define where do I want my clouds. So this is very similar. We're using noise texture for basically everything here, and that's like the game in proceduralism. It's just using noise textures. I'm just generating my clouds. I'm saying use this as a factor mask, and wherever I want clouds, just use like a basic diffuse BSDF and make sure it's connected to the right socket. And let me just play with this so we have a bit of a nice fall off. Now, if you look, this is the kind of thing where you want to look at actual reference so you can see how, visible are the clouds and stuff like this. I'm just going to eyeball it. We're going to say that it looks something like this, and one thing we can do here is because this is driven by noise texture, we can animate the W slider, so we can actually animate the clouds over time. I'm going to use a driver. Hash frame gives me the frame number, divided by 1,000 makes it 1,000 times slower. And let's actually view this in EV for now, even though that's not going to be the final result. It's compiling. Okay, those clouds are moving a bit fast. Let's make them 5 times slower. And also, now that I think about it, we can animate our water waves. Which one is our water waves? This is our land. Don't want to animate that unless, there's some tectonic plate movements. Here we go. This is the water. What I'm going to do is going to animate the W slider again over time. And let's see what this gives us once it renders. By the way, I have a wireless lavalier mic, so I can do this. I'm going to get some water because my throat is parched. And I think you want that good audio quality. Okay. Although people have been complaining that my new mic is trash. Don't know, don't care. So, we have water. It's animating, maybe a bit quickly. So let's bring this down by 3 again. And now we have animating water and clouds. And it's a good look. I'm thinking let's start off with our lighting, and then we can add in asteroids and stuff like this. So, for our lighting, I want to not have an HDRI. In fact, I want to have like a procedural starscape so we actually get semi-accurate lighting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to cycles. Instead of an HDRI, which by the way, in the world tab, this is what an HDRI is. It's an environment texture plugged into a background. We're going to get rid of this. We're actually going to make the background black since we are in space. And you're going to see we no longer see our thing except for the emissive atmosphere. So obviously we need to light this thing. But here's a trick to generate stars. You're going to learn a lot in this tutorial. Also how to make stars. Take a Voronoi texture. Look at the distance. Send this through a color ramp or a subtraction. I'm going to flip these sockets, and if I now bring this down, you're going to notice, oh, there are stars, especially once I make this plentiful. Maybe that's a bit too plentiful. 200. You can see all of a sudden, now we have stars in the background. Why does this work? Voronoi texture, what it does is it generates a bunch of points in 3D space, in this case infinitely far away in the environment, and it calculates the distance of every point to its nearest. Basically, it's going to look at every point, look for its nearest neighbor, and tell us what the distance of that is. If we clamp it, it's going to make these circles that are within some distance of the thing, and that happens to look like stars. We could even get more complicated with this because our Voronoi also has other outputs like the color. We can randomize the color of the stars since some are red shifted and blue shifted. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this as the strength of the background, and I'm going to use the color of the Voronoi as the color of the stars. So now we have a bunch of colored stars that are a bit too colorful, so I'm going to bring down the saturation so that they're very, very slightly colored, but their emissiveness is exactly based on the Voronoi. Now, if you wanted this to be the light source, like you have a bunch of little point lights, each one being a star, which wouldn't generate that much light, but if you wanted to, what you could do is you could take this and like crank it up. So I'm going to multiply it by like 100, and you can see all of a sudden our thing is lit in this kind of very weird way. Honestly, we're not going to do that. So we have our stars, and it's environment texture. So far we're all procedural. For the lighting, may as well use the sun, the star that's very close, to light the thing. So I'm going to add a sun, and this is actually going to make it look much more space-like because we have very harsh lighting in space. So I'm going to rotate the sun so it's kind of pointing this way. I'm going to make it way stronger so we have kind of this bright overexposed feel. And then as for the fall off, you can control it with this slider. It's up to you how much you want to do that by. Now we could do a bit of cheesing that doesn't really make sense. Like for example, the clouds, we can also make a emission, but I think that might look a bit weird. Yep, that looks weird. So we're going to use a diffuse. You could add a bit more lighting with the Fresnel to like light the Earth a bit more. I'm thinking we do the opposite. I'm thinking we make this a bit more into the sphere, but we bring down the strength of the emission so that it's going to be there, but a bit more subtle. So this is what it was before and after. By the way, I'm seeing a lot of glitching here. Let's do a bit of a set shade smooth on this bad boy. So let's see, this is before. You can kind of see the facetting, and then after. Let me add that back in. Okay, that looks pretty good, except for the glitchiness and all this. We could add in another light if need be, or we could just fade this a little. I think that's a good look. And I think, if anything, I feel like my clouds are kind of overtaking this render a little. I'm just going to do one of these. And I really like how we get this specular highlight over here, where it's catching the waves and all this. I think that looks great. Okay, maybe our atmosphere should be a bit bluer. And yeah, and again, if you wanted to make it like a Mars planet, feel free to make it red. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. Let's mess around with some of the lighting, color management stuff. I'm going to make this high contrast. That already looks great. Mess with the gamma, mess with the exposure, just get a look that I want. And I think now, again, all of this, I know I'm emphasizing this over and over again, it's a cube that we subdivided a bunch of times, right? And we made procedural continents, so you can, again, change the look of this. That looks pretty good. And you can make them crisp or like shallow, up to you. I think now what I want to do is I just want to add in a bit of dynamicness other than like camera movement, and I'm going to do that with asteroids, which are also procedural and super easy to make. So for asteroids, I want you to think of these as a bunch of dots. We're going to make a bunch of dots, and we're going to have each one go in a random direction and maybe a random rotation, which will give it this like asteroid feel look to it. Only thing we don't want is any of the asteroids like intersecting with our planet, and it looks weird. So we will try to avoid that. What I'm going to do to generate this asteroid field is I'm going to take a grid and join it, which seems like a weird move, but just follow along. So we have this grid, which, by the way, just an interesting tidbit, because it's going to reflect some of the light, it's going to make our Earth look super dope, but we're not going to actually keep this plane. The plane here is just to distribute a bunch of points that we're going to turn into asteroids. That's why I'm adding it. So I'm going to distribute points on faces. Again, there's only one face here. So now we have a bunch of asteroids, and we can make sure they don't intersect by using Poisson disk distribution. This just makes it so that no 2 points are within some distance of each other, which means they're guaranteed to not intersect. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, use a set position, and I'm going to offset it by its normal. In other words, it's going to go upwards, so the plane normal. So the plane's pointing up, I'm saying go that way. And I want to randomize this so they're not all together. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to scale it, and I'm going to use a random value and make that go up to like 10. So this is kind of like filling in a cube with we're distributing points inside its volume is the way to think about this. There is a node for that in 3.4, but we're using 3.3. So this is our asteroid field. You can make it way bigger, but since I'm like planning to render up close, this is fine. And what I want this to do is I want these asteroids to move over time. So what we can do is we can add a vector. You can think of this as offsetting the points. But here's the cool part. If I use a random vector for this, so we could go from -1 to 1 and x, y, and z, we take this and we scale the randomization. What this effectively does is it makes these asteroids go in random directions because we're adding a custom vector for each one by some magnitude that we can change over time. So if we go to solid view, you can see these are distributing. If I want them to distribute slower, I can divide time, so time is elapsing more slowly, and this is also something I can randomize. So maybe it can go from 5 to 10. So we have our asteroids moving. I mean, some of them are intersecting with our planet, but it doesn't seem to be that big of an issue unless you're rendering this frame where this asteroid goes in here. Quick way to avoid that without getting fancy, and you could get fancy, but just change the seed until you get one that doesn't do that, you know. If you want it to be fancy, by the way, you could add a distance function that says, how close am I to this? If so, hover over it, or something like that. But either way, this is our asteroid field. For each one of these, what I want to do is instance on the point. Why? Because I want each point to inherit an asteroid that I'm going to make. For the asteroid, we're not going to do anything too fancy, so this time I don't care if it's a sphere instead of a cuboid, because they're going to be so small. We're going to take a bunch of spheres. I'm going to, again, you can see I'm using this random value everywhere, just to add in a bit of dynamicness. I'm going to randomize the scale, so we have some big ones, some small ones. You could randomize on X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to. And for the sphere, I just want to break up the shape a little. So I'm going to, anytime we're changing the position of stuff, we use a set position node. We offset by a noise texture. And if you've been around, you know that this kind of shifts everything upwards a little. The correction term for this, and we can get into it, but the correction term is you subtract by the 0.5 vector. So now it just distorts it. Basically, noise adds a value between 0 and 1, on average 0.5, so we need to correct that by bringing it down by 0.5. Either way, take this, scale it. The reason I'm scaling it is to control the size of this effect. And you know what? I do want to randomize this on X, Y, and Z. So it can go from 0.05 to 0.01 on the scale. So we have some that are tall, some that are short, stuff like this. Okay, so you know, these aren't super detailed, but you can't even see them anyways. So I'm thinking this looks pretty good. And let's see what this looks like from the rendered view. Beautiful. Really, we just need to apply a material to this. Another thing I'm going to do, another random value, I'm going to randomize the rotation so that they're not all facing the same way. So here is before, and after. So now they're all just orbiting. And again, you could animate this rotation over time using the same trick I used before. But you can see these are dispersing and they look pretty good. Keep getting text messages. What I'm going to do is, let's wrap up. I'm going to use a set material. So now we have a second procedural material here. So instead of planet, I'm going to make a asteroid. And then for this asteroid, what I'm going to do is just kind of get rid of all of this. And let's do something simple. So you can see our asteroids are black right now. If we use a principled BSDF, they're going to be white. I'm just going to turn down the color, make them rough and not very reflective, and not even use any bump because it just does not matter. Now you pick your camera angle, and that's going to look pretty good. So I think that's the essence of it. You could go crazier. You could add more planets. You could add like Saturn rings and stuff like this. But I wanted to keep it kind of simple, and we're near 30 minutes anyways for the first GeoNodes Nodevember thing. So thank you guys for watching this tutorial. If you enjoyed, please make sure to subscribe so you can see more, especially since I'm uploading every day for Nodevember. And if you want to support the channel, Patreon is the way to do that. There's a link in the description. You get blend files and stuff in return. But if you want to support the channel, that is the way to do it. Get the blend file, and hopefully you enjoyed this Nodevember tutorial. Thank you for watching.